I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. And this is Trish Wood is Critical, where we think critically about most things. I don't think critically about the royal family. I'm a monarchist, and the coronation is coming up on Saturday, which is going to be quite interesting. I don't love King Charles. He's a little woke for me, but I enjoy the pomp and circumstance surrounding the royal family and some of the drama too. So that'll be interesting I'll be watching that. I will be watching that. But on a more serious note, we are talking today about information. And we talk about information a lot on this show. I am a former, let's say, recovering legacy media investigative journalist who has spent quite a lot of time exposing the folly and, in fact, even the perfidy of legacy media and the way they are behaving today. It's terrible. And I hear more and more from people about how even their families are divided. So if you are watching legacy media and curating your social media feed a certain way, and I am partaking of indie media and curating my social media feed a different way, we almost cannot have a conversation. That's what's happening because we are inhabiting two different worlds. We really are. This is not good. And as a culture, as a society, as a people, this is not a sustainable way for us to move through the world. I'm now telling friends of mine, try to just not talk to them about those things. Don't discuss COVID. Don't discuss Tucker Carlson. Don't discuss Ukraine. I mean, it's wild. Completely different versions of what is going on in the world. And I'm sure that they would say the same thing. I mean, you guys know which side I'm on. I'm an indie investigative journalist and analyst now. Not everything I do is journalism. Some of it's opinion, but it's opinion based on research. I don't just spout off, unless I'm talking about a TV show I like or something. But I get the sense that the people on the other side it's almost like they're deluded, right? You can't change their minds with facts or information or data points. You cannot do it. They close down. They're captured. That's how it feels. And I will say this, that I am constantly checking myself. I check what I think about things. I check before I make a declarative statement about something. I don't just live in a world where, like on that side, you can assume to know what I think about things, right? I probably don't line up in the way that you think I might on some things because I try to keep the data and the facts moving through my life, right? That's what I'm doing all day. I don't just sit around here filing my nails. I'm diving into things and saying, well, is that true? Could that be true? Is that real? Was I correct when I said that? I actually do those things, and I do occasionally buy the New York Times and read it to see what they're saying on that side. And they're mostly wrong about most things. And that what that bespeaks is a capture of one of the pillars of democracy, which is the news media. And I hate to say it, but it's true. It's absolutely true. So we're fighting this break in our culture, in our society, in our families, in our workplace on a daily basis. And hey, folks, it is disheartening, and it is also exhausting. It's exhausting. And I feel for people whose families are broken over this. I really, really do. People, we mean you no harm. We mean you no harm. None of you. We just want you to maybe understand that the media doesn't tell the truth. And guess what? The politicians have figured that out. They know they're not going to be fact-checked. Not really. They're doing ever more and more bizarre things. Look at Joe Biden. I mean, just a perfect example of my point, which is here is a man who clearly has dementia. It rolls off of him every time he opens his mouth. He is arrogant. Clearly he's corrupt. There's really no doubt about that now. And everybody is kind of pretending there's nothing wrong. Legacy media hides these things for him. You know, and the GOP are going to write another really mean letter, right? That's what they do. They write really mean letters about these things, and nothing changes. The fact that Joe Biden is in office at all, given the corruption with Hunter Biden and the laptop and the influence peddling and the rest of it, tells you that media is broken. And the fact that Trudeau got away with what he got away with vis-a-vis our truckers tells you the same thing, because they were working for Trudeau during the time that the convoy was in Ottawa. There's no question about that. They weren't doing any favorable coverage at all, and most of what they said wasn't true. So when the politicians have figured out that the media is not going to go after them on certain things, wow, look what happens. Look what happens. And the best example of that, and this is where we really, really learned it and took it on a cellular level during COVID. No hard questions being asked of anybody in a position of power, unless it was about you should be locking down more, you should be making people get vaccines more, you should be closing schools more. That's where the media was. Nobody was asking them to do their jobs, which is risk-benefit weighing and all the sorts of things you normally do under a circumstance like that. But that's where we learned it really, really on a DNA level, that the media was gone and no longer representing the citizenry, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today, and I've got a blockbuster show for you. I'm really proud of what we've got today. I'm proud every week, but especially proud this week. We have from Tablet Magazine a gentleman named Jacob Siegel, who wrote one of the most important pieces of journalism of our time. 10 years ago, when historians look back and say, what the hell happened in 2023 and 2022 and 2021, they will look at this piece by Jacob Siegel and say, I understand it now. It's called A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation. And this piece is being written about and talked about by the best indie journalists and Substack writers in the business, including my friend Chris Bray. It's a game changer. And so we are going to hear from Jacob Siegel himself. I'm going to read to you the précis to the piece that he wrote so you fully understand where we're going, and I'm going to do that in a minute. But then, sort of in keeping with this theme of the informational toxicity in which we live, I'm going to be interviewing a guy named Harold Jonker of Jonker Trucking, who was charged last week with participating in the convoy. I mean, like almost a year and a half later. What is going on? Not big charges, particularly. He lives in around Grimsby there and had to go into the police station there. And he's got to go to Ottawa next week and be fingerprinted in the whole 9 yards. I mean, what is going on here? What is the Crown doing in Ottawa? I don't understand this. So we're going to talk to him after we talk to Jacob Siegel about this wonderful piece. And I want to also tell you that I'm going to be reading a letter I got from a listener. This is at the end of the show, about how the COVID-19 policies affected her abstinence from an addiction. It's something I've talked about a lot on the program, and I don't think it got enough attention, because if you're not in the 12-step community, you don't understand what was lost and how egregious it was for public health to insist that those meetings not be open and that they be held on Zoom. You know, people don't relate to each other over Zoom. Zoom is not real life. We can't stay sober and abstinent on Zoom meetings, and we see it because the numbers of dying addicts and relapses are off the charts right now. Thank you, public health. Thank you very much. And I will also say thank you 12-step programs for not fighting back. I think they should have. And I actually found out later there was one group in Toronto that sort of did. I wish I'd known about it. I would have been there every meeting. Anyway, I'm going to read that letter at the end. So let me do my pitch first, and then we can get to this Jacob Siegel piece, which is extraordinary. We are funded by the people who listen to us, and we've moved our primary funding platform to Substack, where I write the occasional piece. Substack, and we do premium episodes as well for our paying subscribers. The Substack platform for us is primarily a funder for the podcast, but we moved it there because it is a free speech platform. It's a free speech platform. Nobody polices what we do on Substack. So go to Trish Wood is Critical on Substack if you want to support us. You can do it there. I'd be so very grateful. We went through 3 years of COVID. I think I only missed 2 shows because I had COVID without restricting access to any of the material we were doing. And the reason I did that was because I felt it was an emergency. I felt you were being let down by legacy media, and I felt that you deserved to have access to the information because it was an emergency. But now, obviously, I got to make a living, people, and I do pay the people who work for me too. So we would be so very grateful if you would go to Substack and support us there, and you will get some premium material once in a while too. So please do that. I have a website, trishwoodpodcast.com. I'm on Twitter at Wood Reporting. Follow me there. That's where I do most of my kind of angry ranting on a kind of a daily basis. I'm in there engaging on certain things. And I also promote some of my pieces so you can know that they've come out. I have an Instagram as well. And the other thing that's fun is that we do merch on our website page. So if you go there, we have really cool baseball caps. A lot of the stuff we have still is kind of trucker supporting. My favorite is still We the Fringe, which is a play on We the North and the fact that our prime minister called people who supported the convoy fringe. Ugh. I mean, really. And also that Fauci called Jay Bhattacharya and the Great Barrington Docks fringe as well. So fringe is a good place to be. And my TNT radio show, which runs on Saturday live on TNT, I call it On the Fringe in honor of the Great Barrington Docks and our truckers. So We the Fringe is a good cap if you want to buy something celebrating what they did and what we're doing here. It helps us, and I'm grateful for that. So I want to move on to this great, great piece by Jacob Siegel, and I'm going to read to you the prologue, which he calls The Information War. And then we are going to throw to the interview with Jacob Siegel. And after Jacob Siegel, you're going to hear from Harold Jonker of Jonker Trucking just briefly. We caught up with him on the road talking about these charges he's now facing. And then we'll say goodbye. So here we go. A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation by Jacob Siegel. Prologue, The Information War. In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed that he had proof of a communist spy ring operating inside the government. Overnight, the explosive accusation blew up in the national press, but the details kept changing. Initially, McCarthy said he had a list with the names of 205 communists in the State Department. The next day, he revised it to 57. Since he kept the list a secret, the inconsistencies were beside the point. The point was the power of the accusation, which made McCarthy's name synonymous with the politics of the era. For more than half a century, McCarthyism stood as a defining chapter in the worldview of American liberals, a warning about the dangerous allure of blacklists, witch hunts, and demagogues. Until 2017, that is, when another list of alleged Russian agents roiled the American press and political class. A new outfit called Hamilton 68 claimed to have discovered hundreds of Russian-affiliated accounts that had infiltrated Twitter to sow chaos and help Donald Trump win the election. Russia stood accused of hacking social media platforms, the new centers of power, and using them to covertly direct events inside the United States. None of it was true. After reviewing Hamilton's 68 secret list, Twitter's safety officer, Yoel Roth, privately admitted that his company was allowing real people to be, in quotes, unilaterally labeled Russian stooges without evidence or recourse, end quote. The Hamilton 68 episode played out as a nearly shot-for-shot remake of the McCarthy affair, with one important difference. McCarthy faced some resistance from leading journalists as well as from U.S. intelligence agencies and his fellow members of Congress. In our time, those same groups lined up to support the new secret lists and attack anyone who questioned them. When proof emerged earlier this year that Hamilton 68 was a high-level hoax perpetrated against the American people, it was met with a great wall of silence in the national press. The disinterest was so profound, it suggested a matter of principle rather than convenience for the standard-bearers of American liberalism who had lost faith in the promise of freedom and embraced a new ideal. In his last days in office, President Barack Obama made the decision to set the country on a new course. On December 23, 2016, he signed into law the Countering Foreign Propaganda and Disinformation Act, which used the language of defending the homeland to launch an open-ended, offensive information war. Something in the looming specter of Donald Trump and the populist movements of 2016 reawakened sleeping monsters in the West. Disinformation, a half-forgotten relic of the Cold War, was newly spoken of as an urgent existential threat. Russia was said to have exploited the vulnerabilities of the open internet to bypass U.S. strategic defenses by infiltrating private citizens' phones and laptops. The Kremlin's endgame was to colonize the minds of its targets, a tactic cyber warfare specialists call cognitive hacking. Defeating this specter was treated as a matter of national survival. The U.S. is losing at influence warfare, warned a December 2016 article in the defense industry journal Defense One. The article quoted two government insiders arguing that laws written to protect U.S. citizens from state spying were jeopardizing national security. According to Rand Waltzman, a former program manager at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, America's adversaries enjoyed a significant advantage as the result of legal and organizational constraints that we are subject to, and they are not, end quote. The point was echoed by Michael Lumpkin, who headed the State Department's Global Engagement Center, GEC, the agency Obama designated to run the U.S. counter-disinformation campaign. Lumpkin singled out the Privacy Act of 1974, a post-Watergate law protecting U.S. citizens from having their data collected by the government, as antiquated. The 1974 Act was created to make sure that we aren't collecting data on U.S. citizens. Well, by definition, the World Wide Web is worldwide. There is no passport that goes with it. If it's a Tunisian citizen in the United States or a U.S. citizen in Tunisia, I don't have the ability to discern that. If I had more ability to work with that, personally identifiable information, and had access, I could do more targeting and more definitively to make sure I could hit the right message to the right audience at the right time, end quote. The message from the U.S. defense establishment was clear. To win the information war, an existential conflict taking place in the borderless dimensions of cyberspace, the government needed to dispense with outdated legal distinctions between foreign terrorists and American citizens. Since 2016, the federal government has spent billions of dollars on turning the counter-disinformation complex into one of the most powerful forces in the modern world, a sprawling leviathan with tentacles reaching into both the public and private sector, which the government uses to direct a whole of society effort that aims to seize total control over the internet and achieve nothing less than the eradication of human error. So that is the prologue. It goes on. It's terrific. And also does reverberate here too, if we think about Bill C-11, which is going to be handing to the CRTC the power to regulate what we're doing and seeing and thinking about on the internet, which is really, really scary. These are unelected people who are appointed by politicians. So this is not good. It is not good at all. And also today, just to say, the story broke about this gay and trans rights group that's trying to get the CRTC to pull Fox News because they didn't like Tucker, who's gone. But the CRTC announced they are going to have some kind of a process to adjudicate this, which is also absolutely terrifying. I've got a big Substack on that out as well that you could read. So Canada is not immune from this. Canada is not immune from this at all. It's a global effort in Western governments, even though Jacob Siegel is focusing on America. So here's my interview with Jacob Siegel. Hi, Jacob. How are you?
I'm good, Trish. Thanks for having me.
Oh, happy to. I guess I'll start by asking you what it was that prompted you to write this really compelling piece about the age of disinformation that we live in now. Was it one specific thing, or was it sort of a creeping realization that things had gone terribly, terribly wrong?
I would say it's a creeping realization that something had changed very fundamentally, and that there was a powerful new shaping force that I was trying to figure out. So before I made any, judgments about whether things had gone wrong, and obviously I had my own ideas about that, but it really started off with a curiosity about what this thing was. I think it was probably in early 2018. Disinformation, which I had never heard about previously, became ubiquitous. You heard about it everywhere. And not only were you hearing about disinformation everywhere, it was being billed as the most potent threat to American security of our generation. So it was everywhere. No one could quite define it. It was very amorphous. It was very vague and broadly defined. It seemed to have all of these points of overlap and convergence with various political and partisan narratives. And it was the most important thing ever. And we had to take immediate action. And there were all these new disinformation experts who were popping up all over the place. And, I will say that I was skeptical from the beginning insofar as I recognized that the experts, for instance, seemed to be people who had more of a political or ideological orientation than they did a genuine technical expertise. And so in trying to figure out what this thing was, I went deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole, as they say.
Right. It's quite interesting because I struggle with that word disinformation, misinformation. Politicians now fling it about. And it seems to be, not to completely define it, but the way it's utilized as a propaganda tool, it seems to be anything that doesn't fit the narrative that they're trying to craft. Isn't that how they use it now?
I would say that it's anything that threatens their institutional hold on power is disinformation. Now, there is a sort of narrow technical definition of disinformation that goes back to the Cold War, but it's not what it means in popular usage now. The second point I would make about how it's used is, sort of was implied in you mentioning misinformation also, and that is that it's given this air of technical or scientific. It's presented as if it is an actual category of reality or a sort of taxonomic category of information in the world. There are these things. There's disinformation. There's misinformation. They have these technical definitions, but all of that sort of the air of dispassionate, objective description is itself a kind of ruse.
Yes. Yeah. I feel stupid saying it even when I ask you the question, right? Cause I can't, if you had then said, okay, well, Trish, define the difference between disinformation and misinformation, I would say, I don't know, but I'm flinging the phrase around as if I do know, right?
Right. I wrote this essay, Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation. But in this very long essay that I wrote, which is over 13,000 words, I never define disinformation versus misinformation, which is something that was a deliberate choice on my part. Typically when people write about disinformation, it's one of the first things they do is sort of trot out the technical taxonomy. Well, disinformation is a deliberate deception. Misinformation is a, non-deliberate spreading of false news. And I didn't get into any of that because it doesn't bear on the actual meaning here. It is a distraction. Not only does it not bear on the true meaning of these words, it is actively and I would say deliberately an attempt to obfuscate their true meaning by erecting this sort of facade of technical classification around them, when in fact they are blunt political instruments.
Political instruments, that's very interesting. So I just want you to know that before we started talking, I read to our audience the absolutely brilliant prologue about the information war that you write about. But what I want to do now is go through the contents.
Sure.
Of the article the same way you have them kind of listed here, so I don't want to miss anything, right? You talk about Russophobia returns unexpectedly, and that is a bit of a reference to the McCarthy times in a sense, right? That you quite eloquently laid out what happened during the McCarthy hearings, etc. And you're saying that what has happened with the invocation of Russia at every turn is similar. So explain to me how that plays into what you call the origins of contemporary disinformation. What's the connection?
Well, one connection is that there's just this very powerful sort of fear of the Russian menace that is now built into the American psyche, as it were. So it's just, Russia is easy to scapegoat. It's really as simple as that in a sense. And so that's a kind of obvious connection. What the McCarthy era was also known as the Red Scare, and the Red Scare was both about this fear of domestic communist infiltration, some of which indeed was occurring, even if the fear, even if there was a sort of deliberately inflated fear-mongering about it. And then the other part of it was about the Russian menace sort of encroaching all over the world and planning world domination. So that's a powerful thing to play off of. The other obvious sort of point of the other obvious parallel between the two is that they both relied on, both McCarthyism and this modern era of disinformation, both rely on secrets and security state claims about the extent of the threat, which are unprovable because they are kept secret and which are used to manipulate the press and public opinion. So McCarthy has his secret list, which is of, communist agents inside the government, which he won't disclose. The number of people he's alluding to change in the various speeches that he gives about this. And, people who have tried to defend him point out that, well, what about the Rosenbergs? What about Alger Hiss? And they're not wrong insofar as, yes, there were indeed communist agents both inside the government and inside some of the, more sensitive components of the American national security establishment. But they miss the point that in having exaggerated the threat and refusing to be transparent about it, McCarthy ended up promoting this security state power, unaccountable, opaque, bureaucratic power that could then be used against American citizens. And something similar happened with these claims about Russian disinformation, where we would get these pronouncements that Russian disinformation was hacking the American electoral system, or that Russian trolls had infiltrated this or that social media platform, this or that election. But they were always they were always sort of based on appeals to authority. It was that security state official XYZ were making this claim, therefore it had to be true, and the press treated it as true on those terms. They never disclosed the evidentiary basis of these claims. They didn't have an evidentiary basis because the claims were false. In this case, when it came to disinformation, the prime example of this is the Hamilton 68 dashboard. So this was this initiative, this highly touted, highly celebrated initiative, Hamilton 68, which was supposed to be exposing Russian influence online. And it was backed by, really high-level political and security officials. Michael Chertoff, Bill Kristol, it was supposed to represent this kind of bipartisan, patriotic initiative to save America from the Russian menace. But it was all BS. And as I point out in the piece, the Twitter executives knew that it was BS because they could see that the people who the Hamilton 68 initiative was claiming were Russian agents were really just, American conservatives or leftists in some cases who were making sort of anti-establishment arguments and were then getting smeared as Kremlin operatives. So that's the other sort of real deep parallel, is that these claims that promote this fear of Russia and this sense of an imminent, dire threat from Russian infiltration are not based on, transparent arguments about what Russia is doing. They're based on these sort of manipulated secret dossiers that are only trickled out to the public in these very cynical ways.
And the interesting point you make, too, in the opening is that in McCarthy's time, the media was not all in with him. They were being critical of him. And that same kind of media scrutiny and criticism of this kind of thinking is almost non-existent now, isn't it? I mean, they were all in on Hamilton 68, weren't they? Weren't they even using the dashboard to craft stories?
Yes, there were, you can find any number of contemporaneous articles in the Washington Post, New York Times, sort of celebrating the Hamilton 68 initiative, repeating its claims quite uncritically. And that was reflective of this broader shift in the press. And, I don't want to overstate how much resistance there was to McCarthy in his own era, but there was resistance, and that resistance built over time, especially by the time you got to Moreau really sort of leading this charge against him. And eventually Congress itself censures McCarthy. So there was a high level resistance, both from the political class and from the press class, to McCarthy that simply doesn't exist now in our own time. What we had with the press was a totally uncritical repeating of these claims and a unwillingness to examine the sources of those claims. So Hamilton 68 was a project of this group, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, ASD, and that was the sort of umbrella organization I mentioned that had people like Michael Chertoff, Jake Sullivan, Bill Kristol, and numerous other high-level national security officials and members of the kind of, permanent DC political class who were backing this, who are really the ones responsible for it. And rather than interrogating what they were really trying to get out of this, rather than interrogating why these people had come together to create this organization shortly after Trump had been elected, because it was all put together immediately after Trump's election. Yeah. It was all taken at face value in the press that these powerful, important people doing this thing that they claimed was on, in America's national security interest. It all was just uncritically repeated. And I don't think it would have taken that much digging. It's not as if these secrets were buried in a vault. By secrets, I mean, it's not as if the true purposes or the underlying self-interest in these organizations was so difficult to detect. It just took some critical scrutiny. But the press was, at that point, I think both because it had been taken over by its own anti-Trump furor, and also because the press had been so hollowed out over years by that point, it was unwilling or unable to muster that kind of scrutiny.
That's a really interesting point, because I was going to ask you if, when these things happen historically, I always ponder kind of beyond motive, like why did they do this? But was there an element of kind of Trump derangement syndrome? I hate to use that phrase, but behind this, are these well-meaning people? I'll kind of roll my eyes while I say that, but who were led astray by their own reaction to Trump, or were they cynically creating this kind of Russian straw man to use as a political tool against anybody who was not part of the Democratic circle? I guess that's the best way to put it.
Well, I think they were led astray by their underlying beliefs more than by their immediate reaction to Trump. And by that, I mean that it was the belief that democracy had already sort of run its course, and that we needed technocratic expertise as the basis of governance in America rather than democratic self-government. That was the sort of underlying belief that conditioned them to believe that it was a reasonable thing to do in response to an election that didn't go the way they wanted it to go, to organize a sort of open, years-long effort to subvert the legitimacy of the office of the presidency. And, you could say that Trump caused that, but it's not like it required, and obviously Trump was the catalyst for that to coalesce in the way that it coalesced, in this broad-based resistance that was willing to kind of countenance an open coup against the president. But Trump was the immediate trigger, but there was this underlying loss of faith or lack of faith in democracy that had become really the sort of de rigueur position, I think, among a lot of kind of progressive, technocratic members of the American elite, let's say. So that was certainly already there, and it made possible this reaction that occurred.
I guess my question is, why would they have been having a loss of faith in democracy? I don't understand what is the history that would have kind of imbued this group of people with a sense that they needed to behave this way in order to save democracy. I feel like I missed a step then in history. Like, is it just that people who don't think like them, namely, average people, were voting in ways they didn't approve of? And it was that kind of arrogance, or what? What was at play behind that, do you think?
I think that there's an intellectual history to this, and a sort of, a longer history that goes back to the, in some ways to the early progressive movement, in some ways to certain strains of liberal thought in the 20th century. What's interesting here in political terms is that there has always been an open tradition of aristocratic elitism on the right, right? There have always been elements of the right that have been openly in favor of allowing, great men to rule, and that have been openly suspicious of democracy on the grounds that it has this leveling effect, and that it sort of undermines the basis of greatness, and therefore, is more of a constraint on human excellence, and leads to bad outcomes, because the people, the masses, are not who you want to entrust with the great decisions of the age. You need only the tiny minority of sort of aristocratic elites to make those decisions because only they are capable of the wisdom and vision to guide society properly. That's long been understood as a sort of right-wing monarchist or aristocratic tradition. But there is a left-wing technocratic tradition that is not all that much different insofar as it sees scientific expertise as the basis of all proper judgment. And therefore, it sees the technocrats as the elect and sees the technocrats as the only people capable of administering a modern, complex society, and views the people as an impediment to that. And there's that element, that technocratic element, and then there's this sort of quasi-religious turn that liberalism has taken over the last really 2 decades or so, in which the sort of pluralist elements of liberalism, which had been based on the idea that people with differing views had to have a way to live together, that element has been overtaken by this sort of quasi-religious belief that, the eradication of political sin is that a crusade needs to be undertaken to eradicate all political sin and error because, anywhere we find racism, that's incipient genocide. And if we don't eliminate all vestiges of racism and have a total equity ruling over society, then we're allowing the conditions of future grave injustices to take place. This is the kind of rhetoric that's associated with what's called wokeness, and it proffers the idea that that you have this intersectionality of political sins, let's say. So anywhere you find racism, you're also finding an incipient form of gender inequality, and anywhere you find gender inequality, you're also finding an incipient form of trans potential or whatever that all of these things are related. And this is sort of baked into the doctrine of what's referred to as wokeness. And if you really believe that any manifestation of inequality present in society is evidence of systematic injustice that is in a latent stage of what might turn into a new genocide or a new form of slavery if left unchecked, then you have to sort of take the reins of the political system to defeat that, because you're dealing with it's a moral crusade. It's not the give and take of political compromise. So those are the sort of broad, I think, political and intellectual currents. This technocratic element on the one hand, this sort of quasi-religious sense of crusading, liberalism is a moral crusade on the other side. Those come together in this way that makes democracy seem already suspect, because people voting in the wrong way will either undermine the technical basis of society because they're too dumb to understand how these complex systems work, and they're going to melt the ice caps, or they refuse to take vaccines, or they are enablers of systemic racism, so they can't be trusted in that way. All of that comes together with the natural, and this is a really important point, because it comes together with the natural tendency of bureaucracies to want to protect their own power. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So everything that I've just described in the realm of ideas is important, but probably ultimately impossible to put into effect in a country like America, where people are accustomed to self-government and want to, they believe they should have the right to choose their own political leaders. It would be impossible to put into effect without the power of the bureaucracies on their side. And the federal bureaucracies in particular, which operate as a kind of shadow unelected government, believe in their own, essentially in their own unlimited and unchecked power, and will do what it takes to preserve that.
As you're speaking there, I'm thinking of the, the Hillary Clinton clip about Donald Trump where she does her big spiel about being homophobic and transphobic and misogynist, that whole sort of list. And I thought, well, I remember when I saw it, I thought, what is she doing here? What is the purpose of her saying what she's saying? And of course, years later, it all makes sense now that she was playing into a political game that they were about to start playing in a really serious way, dividing people and not allowing people to think clearly for themselves. That's what it felt like anyway.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the dividing people is the first step. It's essentially delegitimizing half of the electorate, saying that they are outside the bounds of normalcy and they're outside the bounds of, sort of standard functioning liberal democracy.
And she also was pushing the Russia hoax a great deal. I want to get a little bit more granular, but before I do, the title of this piece is A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century. What are you referring to when you use the word hoax?
I'm referring to the claim that disinformation is an imminent existential threat to America and to liberal democracy itself, and that if we don't deal with disinformation, that the country will be ruined. And it's left deliberately vague, so maybe we'll be invaded, maybe the whole political system will crumble, maybe it'll be taken over from within by the Kremlin. But that's the hoax, that there was this grave existential threat of disinformation that required Americans to give up their constitutional liberties, give up their right to privacy, give up their right to free speech, and give all of that over to unaccountable figures in the national security establishment who would censor on their behalf to protect them from this grave threat of disinformation. But there was no grave threat of disinformation. There is no grave threat of disinformation in that sense. It was the threat itself that was manufactured and exaggerated to accomplish a political goal, which was to seize power over the internet, and by seizing power over the internet to thereby control the electorate.
Yeah, I think that's really smart. We're seeing that here because our national broadcaster, CBC, where I used to work, is being heavily criticized for their far left-lean, ideologically driven news coverage. If you can't even call it that anymore. But when Catherine Tate, the president, is pushed on why indie media is doing so well and their listeners and viewers are peeling off, she always says it's about misinformation and disinformation. Like that's also used against anybody in the independent media who are challenging these kind of constructed narratives coming out of legacy media, right? And no one ever says to her, well, what do you mean, Ms. Tate? Like what specific thing are you talking about? Because what I've learned, Jacob, and I'm sure you did too, is that the deeper you dive and the more granular you become in these things, the less they hold up. None of these things they say hold up under scrutiny when you ask for details, do they?
No, they don't. And I think you've just hit the nail on the head in terms of why the press was so eager to embrace this narrative, because it puts them back in power. So, the press is bleeding legitimacy. The press is bleeding readers, viewers who don't trust. By the press, I mean the sort of pillars, institutional pillars of the press, both in Canada and the U.S., who are seeing that there's this general, survey after survey shows that there's this absolute collapse of trust in the media. And disinformation comes along, and it allows the media to both see itself as a victim of this malicious, malignant force. Oh, the problem isn't us. The problem is disinformation. And at the same time, allows them to elevate themselves to this position of, enlightened information regulators. And again, this is the sort of progressive technocratic underpinning of this whole worldview. Because, in a sort of democratic tradition, the world is messy. Different ideas are jostling around, and the function of the press is to report on what's going on, and then people make up their own minds, right? And maybe you don't arrive at the ultimate truth. Maybe you haven't saved democracy in the process of writing an article or reading an article, but, you have given people the opportunity to avail themselves of relevant information about the world around them such that maybe they can marginally improve the conditions of their own lives or vote a bit more intelligently, whatever, something along those lines. Well, that's replaced here in this sort of disinformation worldview by a function for the press as this on high guardians of the political system who can blame everything. Disinformation for them becomes a synonym for anything that challenges us. And so it places them in this very elevated position and also conveniently allows them to demonize any challengers.
Well, it's also a total conflict of interest too, isn't it? Because what they're doing is critiquing their critics by saying that there's something else going on here. They must be Russian operatives or whatever. It's a very scary time, and I get quite upset about news organizations that use this epithet as a way to defend themselves because it's so disingenuous. It's so absurd. And I just want to say, people are peeling off because you're lying all the time. That's why. Just stop lying and you can get your audience back. But they don't want to do that. They want to just keep on going.
Yeah, I would say even more fundamentally, it would be great to stop lying, but I would say even more fundamentally, stop trying to be arbiters of truth. That's not your role. That's what a clerisy does. People will go to their churches and synagogues and mosques to find arbiters of ultimate truth. The press, it should report on the world.
Yeah, and I guess as someone who was very, very heavily involved in COVID coverage for the last 3 years, that many of the things that they accused of being disinformation around COVID turned out to be true, and that the people who said those things were actually prescient, esteemed, admirable scientists who had a different view but were kept out of the conversation because DC wanted everybody to believe that there was a consensus around the public policy. And they never say, oh, well, we're wrong. He was actually right about myocarditis, whatever it is. They never rescind it, right? It never always stays there forever. Awful. And it's such a personal attack on people. So I want to get more detail from this great piece. So you talk about how, this current, you call it an information war. Boy, do I agree with that. I do think it's an information war. Props to Alex Jones. Infowars, yeah.
Yeah.
So you call it an information war, and I think it's absolutely true. And you say that the foundations for it were laid in response to a sequence of events that happened in 2014, which is around the Maidan revolution in Ukraine. So let's talk about that, because I think that's a really interesting story, especially now that everybody's talking about Ukraine again. A lot of people don't understand that 2014 was sort of the year that sowed the seeds for what's happening there now as well.
So there are really three events in 2014. Maidan is one of them. And then there's another event involving Russia, which is Russia's invasion of Crimea. And the third event is when the Islamic State takes over Mosul, a city in northern Iraq that it captures and then declares to be the capital of its new caliphate. And what those three events have in common is that social media is a very prominent, globally visible instrument of warfare in all three of those campaigns. So in Crimea, there's this sort of influence operation that precedes the actual Russian invasion, which is, sort of laying the foundation, the sort of narrative foundation for the idea that Crimea rightfully belongs to Russia and that there's a popular support for Russia taking control over Crimean from Crimeans. In Maidan, there's this back and forth information and narrative warfare going on between both the U.S.-backed Maidan movement in Ukraine and the, and Russia itself, and then the Russian-backed elements in Ukraine. And social media plays a very prominent role there on both sides. And finally, with the Islamic State, there's this really lurid, very graphic social media campaign that ISIS undertakes in order to, sort of advertise its barbarism as a recruiting method, because bored second generation Europeans seeing this footage of pillage are hopefully, in their mind, hopefully going to be seduced to come join the caliphate. And also seeing this sort of Muslim conquest going on, are going to be seduced to come join. And then also as a method to intimidate their enemies. And so if you show enough graphic beheading videos, the idea is, hopefully you won't have to fight the next battle because you'll have scared people sufficiently that they'll just run away. So in all three of those cases, in Crimea, in Maidan, and with ISIS in Iraq and Syria, you have social media as what appears to be a key instrument of warfare. Excuse me. And this relates to a popular theory of warfare called hybrid warfare. And hybrid warfare in technical terms is war that combines covert and overt operations, conventional and special operations, and especially relies heavily on informational tactics. So, memes, trolling, but also the production of narrative and dissemination of narrative through media organs. And this notion of hybrid warfare becomes very popular within the U.S. and NATO defense establishment. And it's popular both because I think they're trying to come to terms with the uses and role of the internet in contemporary warfare. And it's obvious to everyone that the internet has changed things, and now war is taking place online to some extent, as well as physically on the battlefield. And it's also an attempt to sort of make sense of this, what is thought to be this new Russian doctrine of warfare. And this is, at various times there are different names given to it and different people who are said to be the proponents of this Russian doctrine. There's the Gerasimov doctrine, and in general there's this idea that Russia is using these sneaky, subversive, informational tactics as a way to weaken and demoralize the West. And indeed, Russia is doing some of that, right, as are other countries. The real question is how effective this is and how much this represents a sort of revolutionary change in the nature of warfare. But in any event, at the time, this becomes the sort of the hot new theory of how war is fought and will be fought in the future. And it goes by a few different names, but the most popular and a sort of umbrella term for it is hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare, because it places so much prominence on the internet and on informational tactics, lends itself very naturally to the idea that the internet is now the primary domain of conflict. And if the internet is the primary domain of conflict, then that means that the things people say on the internet are, whether intentionally or not, potentially tools of warfare. And so it leads to this blurring of what are very important and essential distinctions between foreign and domestic, between peace and war. And it allows the proponents of these ideas to present effectively any political statements that they interpret or they claim are pro-Russian. They can now say, not only is this pro-Russian or not only is this politically objectionable, but this is now a tool or a weapon in an ongoing war. You have been recruited into this element of this hybrid warfare campaign. And in 2015 and 2016, the next natural step occurs, which is you have these key individuals like Clint Watts, who becomes the figurehead of the Hamilton 68 dashboard that we talked about at the beginning of the program. Clint Watts begins to write a series of articles in the Daily Beast where he makes claims, effectively saying that Trump supporters and Russian disinformation agents are impossible to distinguish online, right? That they have merged. And he says this very directly. So what's the logical conclusion of that? The logical conclusion of that is that millions of Americans are now acting as agents of a hostile foreign power. So he lays the foundations of this, and there are other people, but he's among the most prominent. He lays the foundations of this in 2015, and then by 2016, it takes the next turn with the election and with the claims that Trump is a Putin agent and that Russia hacked the U.S. election.
You know, this is a very, very significant thing you've just described, because it's almost as if it's something that you can't undo. And how can I put this? I guess I've grown weary of trying to convince normally critically thinking people that Russiagate was essentially a hoax and not true. And in a sense, it seems to live on because of this internet connection that you described. It's like a whack-a-mole game. If you say, well, no, that didn't happen, you can bat that away. No, that didn't happen. But there's always something about how the internet was responsible for getting Trump elected. It was I suppose one would have to admire its effectiveness as a tool against Trump, but I think it's tainted political thought and journalistic credibility for maybe a generation. I mean, I'll give you an example. Up here with our truckers, the CBC where I used to work said, oh, there's information that they're being influenced by Russia. And there's like literally no evidence of that. Right. But you can trot that out under any circumstance of anybody who's challenging the elites, and it has credibility. I mean, it really feels like McCarthy, right? Every person you don't agree with is a Russian agent.
Right, and never pay any cost for that. You can trot that out, make that claim, and then just simply move on. You know, it just disappears. But what they're losing is they're losing the credibility with readers, which is important in its own way and places more stress on the system.
I remember trying to get to the bottom of those allegations. Am I right that Russia purchased something like $45,000 worth of Facebook ads, and that was it?
It was a little over $100,000, but not all of them were for Trump. So only a little more than half of them were for Trump. So look, let's say all of them were for Trump. A little more than $100,000 worth of Facebook ads is nothing. Right? It's a drop in a bucket. Yeah. It's not even a drop in a bucket. So this was, but of course you heard over and over again about the Facebook ad purchases. And when you go through the evidence, they all turn out to be, big nothings in the same way that the Facebook ad purchases were. So, the claim that there were however many millions of impressions, with these, there was just to be clear, right? There were what appeared to be genuine agents of the Russian government who were employed as sort of professional trolls and were spreading certain memes, online with the intention of confusing and, sowing chaos in the American political system and in other countries. So there is some legitimate evidence for that, but it was occurring on a very small and limited basis, and there's no evidence whatsoever that it was effective. So the way that this gets covered up, the way that this rather marginal and quite ineffective campaign gets turned into the biggest threat and the biggest story in the world that sabotaged the election is through these elisions and evasions that make things that are actually rather innocuous seem deadly. So, for instance, you would hear these accounts of there were tens of millions of impressions for these Russian memes. But first of all, not all of those memes were pro-Trump. Some of them were anti-Trump. And all an impression means is that somebody glanced at it on a screen or passed by it on their screen. It doesn't mean that they took it in. It doesn't mean they thought about it. It certainly doesn't mean that it changed their thinking or convinced them to vote for one candidate over another. And there's pretty robust social science research showing that people's political opinions are not so easily swayed that they're going to see some ridiculous, rather crudely put together Russian meme and all of a sudden vote for a different candidate or all of a sudden have some fundamental transformation in their own political thinking. There's a brilliant French philosopher named Jacques Ellul who wrote a book in the 1950s, I believe it was published, called Propaganda, the Formation of Men's Attitudes. Ellul is somebody I would recommend to your listeners to check out. He's a difficult writer, but he's very brilliant. He was
Spell it?
fought in the Ellul, Jacques Ellul.
Okay, good, thank you.
And he fought in the French Resistance. He was a Christian anarchist. He had a very unique political philosophy, and he wrote this book about propaganda. He's not the easiest writer to read, but he's an important writer.
Okay, good.
And in this book about propaganda, he makes the point that he makes a number of points that are salient to this conversation, but the immediate one is that it's always more difficult to create effective propaganda targeted at a foreign audience than it is to create effective propaganda for a domestic audience, because you don't know the foreign audience as well. And the aims of the propaganda are not going to naturally align with these self-interests of powerful sectors of society. So when Russia attempts to influence the American political system, it's working at a natural disadvantage. In the same way that when America tries to influence the political systems of other countries, as we do, including through our own sort of, trolling and meme campaigns, which are documented, we're also working at a disadvantage in America when we try to do that, because we don't share a set of cultural priors with the people who are trying to influence. So these Russian memes, it's not just that they were actually quite small in terms of the number of ad purchases or the number of impressions given the absolute vastness of the internet. It's also that there's every reason to believe that they would not have been effective because they were so crude.
Yeah.
They're so they misunderstood the nature of American politics. They're like these ridiculous anti-Hillary and anti-Donald Trump cartoons that you can find online that were crafted as part of this campaign. So all of these things, one after the other, and the same goes for Cambridge Analytica, by the way, which when it finally went to a lawsuit, when it went into the court system in Britain and they actually took apart and forensically analyzed the claims about what Cambridge Analytica had done during the election, what they found was that many of the biggest claims about what Cambridge Analytica could do were just PR put out by the company itself, that it had, it had all these sort of boasts about its advanced psychometric campaigns, that it could create these very advanced profiles of voters, and then you could do these sort of targeted influence operations. But this was it was the company's own PR language. It was a sales pitch. They couldn't actually do that. And this is what came out in the British court system. So in one case after another, these grandiose claims about Russian interference in the U.S. election turned out to be essentially nothing.
And I have to tell you that when I heard about them, I at one point had those Facebook ads in a file in my desk. I probably put it in a banker's box in the basement now, but they were laughable. Right. They were, they didn't even seem to have any credit. They were like written by some maybe really low-level diplomat somewhere. I don't know, but they lacked credibility. I want to ask you about one of the stories that you write about, and the headline was How Russia Dominates Your Twitter Feed to Promote Lies and Trump Too. You say Watts and his co-author Andrew Weisberg described how Russia had revived its Cold War era active measures campaign using propaganda and disinformation to influence foreign audiences. This is what you just said, and this headline, which really, I have to tell you, it really bugs me because they're making declarative statements about things that aren't really all true. And it also speaks to the issue we talked about before, which is granularity. These things do not stand the test of critical thinking and actually investigating what's being said, do they?
No, I don't think I think they wither under that test. But, to be clear, I don't think that these were deliberate lies necessarily, especially at this stage. I believe that article you're referring to was written might have been the summer of 2016. I had known Watts a bit prior to that article, and I had actually quoted him because I was interested in these same questions at the time, and I had been reporting on ISIS's campaign in Iraq, and I was interested in ISIS's and the Islamic State's social media efforts, and I had spoken with Watts, and I had quoted him in a piece that I wrote, I believe in 2014, after I'd gone to Iraq as a reporter. I wrote a piece about, ISIS using social media to reach Western audiences. And I spoke with Watts, and he was part of a sort of cohort of counterterrorism analysts who were particularly interested in the internet and social media, and they were trying to make sense of what effect these things were having. And they, I think what happened, and this is to some degree me speculating and imputing some motive, so I'll say that I don't know, but I think perhaps part of what happened was they got carried away with their own theories. Everybody could tell that social media was having some kind of big effect, at least on the spectacle of warfare, on the public arena of warfare. Everyone observing these things, just seeing these images coming from these ISIS accounts, it was sort of shocking and titillating, and there was a real effort to make sense of it, and an effort to analyze the mechanics of how these campaigns were working and to break them down and say, okay, for instance, ISIS was using bots to retweet stuff. So some of these big ISIS hashtags that were intended to suggest that the group had tens of thousands of followers were actually just a few key amplifier accounts that were then being spread by these sort of bot accounts. And so there was a genuine effort to make sense of this stuff and to figure out what effect it was having on warfare and what effect it was having on social formations. And I think people got carried away with it, and they lost track of what they could prove and what was merely speculation, and in particular they lost track of the difference between a sort of a theory and a political claim, or they lost track of the way in which their theories were being recruited as tools of domestic politics. And maybe that's an overly charitable interpretation to say that this was an unwitting development or not something that they had planned, but I do think it's plausible that it happened that way because the people involved in this stuff were genuinely interested in it and trying to figure out how social media was being used, how it could be used to manipulate war and manipulate politics. But I think that they got carried away and failed to hold themselves to what they could actually prove or demonstrate, and started to get more and more sort of puffed up and inflationary in the claims they were making.
Well, I think that generally one of the criticisms I have now about what's happened to journalism and essays and other bits of reporting in the last 10 years is that it seems everybody or many people in legacy media now feel it's perfectly okay to make declarative statements about things that they can't be declarative about. And that's what bothered me about that headline. I think they were too declarative, about what they thought that they discovered. And that's a problem that's repeated over and over again on a multitude of subjects right now. And then those declarative statements become like a mantra. You can't argue against them because they've said a declarative thing, and by God, it must be true. It's very dangerous.
Yeah, and indeed, that's exactly what happened with that article. And beyond the headline, there were these other declarative statements inside the piece about, as I mentioned earlier, about Trumpkins and Russian agents merging and becoming indistinguishable. Yeah, and exactly what you just described is what happened with that piece.
I love what you say in later on in this section of the article. You're talking about what Trump represented to the elites. That was so upsetting. And you say that he was not a normal politician, but an ogre, which is a great way to describe him, and that he horrified Americans who felt a personal betrayal and the possibility that he would occupy the same office held by George Washington and Abe Lincoln. That's a very, very good line. Thanks for writing it.
Thank you.
Punitive, that rather than his punitive racism or flagrant unpresidentialness that sent the ruling class into a state of apoplexy, bravo, that deserves a round of applause. But the other thing you say that's really interesting is that they felt the same kind of fear about Bernie Sanders. And you say that they successfully sabotaged him. Well, that's so interesting because I, believe it or not, was a Bernie Sanders supporter back in the day. I've switched my allegiances culturally and politically in many other ways, but I watched him be dismantled by media and the Democratic Party. And I wish he'd actually said that that's what had happened instead of just going along with it.
Yeah.
Right, but they weren't able to do that. You say that Democrats successfully sabotaged Sanders. Trump made it past his party's gatekeepers. Wow. So that's so true. And I think people maybe didn't expect that could ever happen, did they? So it was like full panic mode. What are we doing with an outsider here? Oh no.
They never thought it was going to happen, and when it did happen, they went into full freak-out mode. It's worth mentioning that with Sanders, and this is 2016 Sanders, because I think 2020 Sanders was a very different animal. But in 2016, it's worth recalling that many of the same, Russian troll, Russian fellow traveler claims were being made about Sanders supporters. They were being accused of being Russian agents too, in the same way that Trump and Trump supporters were getting that smear leveled at them. So there was a similar effort to target Sanders supporters, including from members of the media who, I think that there's been a bit of a revisionist history about the treatment that Sanders got in 2016 from the media. I think that there was the whole Bernie bro thing, and there were real efforts to delegitimize Sanders. But he, unfortunately, I agree. He sort of he didn't fight back against that very effectively.
No, and you could see it in the way he was being interviewed by people. They would be really in full accountability mode with Bernie. Even almost questions like, when did you stop beating your wife? Not that question, but the kind of question that you can't answer in a way without looking bad. And Hillary would skate on everything. It was so obvious what they were doing. It was actually so obvious what they were doing. I was sending Bernie's wife talking points for him because I thought he was, I believed in what he was saying, for good or ill. I did. And I thought, why is this guy who's, running for the head of the DNC, why does he not have a comms department that's helping him fight? Like, Bernie Bros was stupid. It was a lie. I couldn't believe that he flamed out the way he did. It was incredible.
Yeah.
Right, not fighting back. And then you mentioned this great Chuck Schumer line. Could you let's talk about that line, which rings in my head watching how things unfold in Washington these days.
Yeah, so this is a line that Schumer gives. I believe it's in mid-January 2017. In any event, it's just a few weeks into 2017 and, the new Trump White House era, and Schumer's appearing on the Rachel Maddow show. And he tells Maddow that it was really dumb of Trump to get on the bad side of the intelligence agencies. And then he tells her that they have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you. And, he's sort of smirking when he says it. And it's just this incredible moment when, senior Democratic member of Congress is openly acknowledging that the unelected security agencies will take revenge against the elected representative of the American people because they don't like the way that he was talking about them. And it's done in this wink, wink, smirking way, but that's perhaps the only way you can get somebody to acknowledge just how much power these agencies have, excuse me, including not just power, but a power unchained from, normal sort of regulatory and administrative measures that might prevent them from using that power to exercise revenge, right? It's not just that they're powerful, it's that they're autonomous and self-interested. And if you get on their bad side, they'll make you pay for it, which indeed is exactly what they did.
You go on to talk about how, use this great phrase, that this political strategy was given the appearance of objective validity through repetition, right? Donald Trump won because of Facebook. New York Magazine, Facebook in crosshairs after election is said to question its influence. New York Times. I mean, it's really, really interesting in a post January 6th world where now if you question an election, you're conservative, it's election denialism. You're just not allowed to talk about it right now. And yet that's what happened when Trump was elected, with not very much evidence at all. In fact, no real evidence that's actually what happened. I mean, things are so upside down.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's this strange asymmetry where the things that Democrats do on a mass basis in a sort of society-wide institutional way. So take election delegitimization as the obvious example here. The Democrats do that in a way that is so vast, so overt, that it ceases to signify the thing itself and becomes sort of just baked into the structure of reality, right? So the way that Trump's election was delegitimized was so widespread, was so ubiquitous, was repeated by so many different institutions that it ceased to have the appearance of an effort to delegitimize him in a pointed political way and became simply a structure of the way things are, how we understand the world. It was like, a basic functioning premise in these places. Facebook having thrown the election being a perfect example of this, which, as you point out, occurred through this repetition. It was just said enough times. Facebook did it. Facebook cost Trump the election, and then it took on the appearance of truth. There's no factual basis for this at all. It was actually, in factual terms, it was absurd. It's obvious that Facebook didn't cost Trump the election. Trump used Facebook well. But the idea that Russian subversion of Facebook cost Trump the election is a flatly absurd, easily disprovable statement. But it became sort of baked into the architecture of normal, moderate thinking, you might say. So the claims coming from one side have the appearance of normalcy and of consensus centrism. When they come from the other side, they appear, justifiably in the case of January 6th, they appear sort of garish and cartoonish and hysterical and ogreish. And so there's this basic asymmetry in how these things work.
Yeah, it seems terribly, terribly unfair. I want to talk to you about, you kind of mention in it, in your article, the idea of the word freedom and a freedom agenda being kind of toxified in the way that that language is dealt with on the internet. And we certainly saw that here with our trucker movement. a lot of the people driving the trucks, the men who came in, they call themselves, freedom motivated against vaccine mandates and other things too. But in Canada now, when the word freedom is trending on Twitter by, you could say the other side, they put a B at the end, so it's freedom, like D-U-M-B, freedom, right? The word freedom has been bastardized. It's an epithet now, which did somebody do that on purpose somewhere deep in the bowels of counterintelligence or something? I mean, how did that happen, that this word that your country was founded on, allegedly, and ours aspires to, has become this dirty word?
It's a good question. I doubt that that was a CIA op, but who knows? It might have been. I tend to think that this is more to do with what we were discussing earlier, which is this broad philosophical, historical trend away from faith in democracy and towards a belief in the power of technocratic experts. So if you believe in democracy, and self-government, then you require freedom, right? Freedom is essential to the exercise of self-government. If you believe that individuals are endowed with certain rights from their creator and that their political sovereignty comes from those rights that they are endowed with from their creator, then it makes sense that they should be free. But if you have a more sort of modern, rationalistic, utilitarian, technocratic outlook, and you see people as simply agents in complex systems, not as sovereign individuals not as created sovereign individuals, but as rational, utility maximizing agents, then maybe they don't need freedom. They need to be employed in the most effective way to optimize for the correct outcome. And the people best positioned to optimize them for that outcome are not the individuals themselves, but the experts of those particular systems, whether it's Anthony Fauci or transportation minister or Justin Trudeau or whomever. And I'm sure that sounds pretty lofty and abstract, and like it doesn't exactly answer the question of how we got to freedom with a B on the end. But I do think that that's what's underlying it. I think like in the same way that free speech was turned into a dirty word in America, and this has happened over the last 10 years when the leading lights of the progressive left in the U.S. began to mock the very idea of free speech as being antiquated and retrograde and a tool of white supremacy and merely a cover behind which systematic oppressors hid their oppression. And this has, I should say, there is a real intellectual lineage to all of this, going back to, certainly as recently as the mid 20th century, and people like Sartre, a French philosopher, and Frantz Fanon, and these attacks on humanism and liberal humanism as being merely the vehicle through which oppression and imperialism manifests itself. So this is a sort of long-standing critique that behind the West's claims of liberal humanistic principles, it actually enacts these programs of mass oppression. And, at various points you could make that critique with more or less legitimacy, but it became a sort of, it became a way of delegitimizing the foundational elements of not of critiquing particular actions undertaken by the West or by Western countries, but by delegitimizing the foundational elements of the Western democratic political system, including free speech, including freedom. And it reached a point where if you wanted to show that you were a sophisticated person in New York or in DC or perhaps in Toronto or wherever, you had to show that you knew that free speech was a a silly cliche used only by conservatives, and that, sophisticated people understood that the point was not freedom of speech, the point was correct speech. And that's been going on overtly, at least for a decade.
I'm still a person who says how heroic I think I believe it was the ACLU was to defend the march in Skokie, which was obviously abhorrent, but it's like, what hill are you going to die on? And it seems like nobody is going to die on a hill anymore, right? They just slide the moral boundaries around and make them convenient to what they're doing, instead of thinking we have to do hard things. Having a free country and a free press and free elections and free people is a hard thing. And I think they're not up for that task. I think, first of all, they're probably threatened by the reality of that, right? Because they want to be the technocrats governing us all, obviously. But I think they just don't want to do that hard work either, because it's threatening. And I think their ideas don't stand up to scrutiny. That's probably part of it too.
I think that's a major part of it, is that their ideas don't stand up to scrutiny, and so they turn to these regulatory systems as a way of avoiding real debate.
Tell me about Yoel Roth, because he's shown up in the Twitter files vis-a-vis COVID coverage, and also about some of the Russian nonsense. I can't quite figure him out, because he seems to be quite a smart chap who is saying, oh, that's really bad, we can't do that, or that's bullshit, I don't believe that's true. And yet, I mean, all of this terrible stuff happened under his tenure at Twitter. So how do you explain Mr. Roth? Did you come to some idea of who he is and what he's about? Did he speak to you even?
No, I didn't speak to him, and I can't say that I have any deep understanding of Roth, but just to sort of sketch him out in profile, he was Twitter's safety officer. He was a top executive at the company. He left only a few months ago, I believe, and he was there during a number of critical junctures with the election of Trump and with the Hunter Biden laptops. He was in a position to make some important decisions. He's from everything we can see of his public politics, he's a sort of standard progressive in many ways, anti-Trump. But we also know that from the internal emails that internal communications that Matt Taibbi obtained through the Twitter files, that Roth was one of the people who was calling BS inside the company on Hamilton 68. Yeah. And he was openly saying, we need to push back about that. We need to push back against this. These people, or this program, Hamilton 68, is smearing Americans as Russian agents with no evidence. And the way they knew this, by the way, was that because Hamilton 68 claimed to have in its possession a list of some 600 Russian agents. And it claimed that it used this list of 600 Russian agents in order to then map out a far larger network of Russian influence. So in effect, what they were saying was that they could tell because they had the core list of Russian agents, therefore anybody who retweeted these Russian agents or interacted with them in a kind of friendly manner could be understood to be in the same influence network. That was Hamilton 68's claim. And they refused to publish the list of Russian agents that they claimed to have, these 600, on the grounds that doing so would compromise their ability to track this influence network. Well, Twitter was in a position to actually reverse engineer this list. So they figured out inside the company who the supposed Russian agents were that Hamilton 68 was basing its whole dashboard on. And what they found was they were overwhelmingly just normal American citizens.
Yeah.
This was who the company and, the word used in the leaked internal communications was that they were smearing these normal Americans as Russian agents. And Roth was one of the people inside the company saying, hey, we should push back against this. But he never did. And so it went uncommented on. Hamilton 68 was allowed to continue its activities. It was allowed to continue smearing these Americans as Russian agents, despite the fact that people like Roth inside of Twitter, multiple people, knew that it was all BS. And bullshit is the word Roth used to describe it. So he seems to be this character who has rather standard progressive politics on the one hand, but on the other hand retains some kind of residual attachment to the idea of an open press and of free speech and of not smearing Americans as Russian agents without any recourse. He has these sort of residual attachments to an older version of liberalism, but that he doesn't act on when push comes to shove. We only know about any of this because it's leaked by Musk years later and Taibbi reports on it.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have that much of a commitment to these ideas.
Well, you know what I think? I hate to be crass about it, but I think the problem with all of the BSers right now, including legacy media and the people who work in tech like Joel Roth, I don't know them, so this is a hypothesis, but they all make so much money. You know, this is a very smooth. I remember back in the day, like 30 years ago, when people used to go to be an anchor person in San Francisco and they would immediately be making $1 million a year, right? And I thought, like, you can't, this is too much money. You can't do this. And I think once that there is a lot of money being thrown around at people, it's really easy to push down feelings that maybe you're doing something that's not all that moral.
I'm sure that's right. Yeah.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about John Brennan, because he appears as a character in a lot, like he signed a letter about the laptop that was nonsense, and he obviously appears in your great piece as well. What is this? Is he just a political operative now, or what is the deal with John Brennan?
Well, I couldn't have said it any better. Yeah, he's just a political operative now. It's not clear to me he was anything other than a political operative even earlier in his career, but despite being the head of the CIA. Brennan, to place him in context here, is the key intelligence figure who establishes the popular idea that Trump is a Putin agent, that Putin favored Donald Trump, and, gives this claim, this false claim, the appearance of being a broadly shared assessment within the intelligence community. And he does this through the vehicle of the ICA. So this is the first big intelligence document on these Russia claims to come out. I say the exact date in the piece. I don't remember exactly when it came out, but it's in early 2017, very early in 2017.
January 6th.
So the ICA is the Intelligence Community Assessment, right? And it's supposed to represent a consensus across the various intelligence agencies. So it is not supposed to be just a CIA product or just an NSA product. It's supposed to represent the consensus assessment of the various intelligence communities. And this ICA said that, asserted that the Russian government and Vladimir Putin had a clear preference for Donald Trump, and that they had, Russian government had interfered in the U.S. election to help Trump get elected. Now, what's notable here is that it later comes out that rather than truly being a reflection of the assessment of the 17 different intel agencies, it was actually just a very small group of analysts personally handpicked and led by John Brennan, who was then the CIA chief. In his final days as the CIA chief, he was an Obama appointee. He would leave when Trump came into office. That it was actually Brennan leading the whole thing with a handpicked group of analysts. And by the way, just so it's clear how we know this comes out in later. There's classified House testimony on this. There's a classified House report that aspects of it or sections of it get leaked, and that's how we know this about how the ICA was put together. So it was led by Brennan with hand-picked analysts, and those analysts were intentionally leaving out the opinions of other Russia expert analysts who were arguing that no, Putin didn't want to get Trump elected. Putin actually favored Hillary Clinton because he viewed her as a more normal, more stable, predictable political figure, which is, Who knows what Putin was actually thinking, but it's certainly a plausible interpretation, right? This whole idea that like, oh, it's natural to assume that Putin and Trump had some connection is total historical fabrication.
Yeah.
It would have been far more natural to assume that Clinton would have been the preferred candidate. And indeed, that is what some analysts thought. But Brennan deliberately leaves them out, or, censors them from the official record in order to produce this document that then becomes a foundational text that everybody else can then point to and say, oh, there's this ICA assessment, again, giving the sort of appearance of a objective, dispassionate assessment to what is in fact a overtly partisan political instrument. And Brennan now, works at MSNBC and has established himself as a leading sort of resistance MSNBC figure. And maybe that's what he was all along, even when he was heading the CIA.
Yeah, wow. So let's move along to COVID times, obviously, because there's a lot of similarities in the way that COVID information and what they call disinformation, counter disinformation, is one of the most powerful forces in American society, which you write here. And I will tell you something, my friend Paul Thacker has a whole Substack blog now.
Oh yeah, Paul's great.
Yeah, he just writes about all the phonies in the fact-checking world and all the stuff they get wrong. And I mean, he's got his own industry going fact-checking to fact-checkers because they're so absurd, right? So, and that really grew very, very quickly under COVID-19 that you just could not, no matter how esteemed, how credentialed, how correct, how much data you had, you could not, it was not permissible to question what was coming out of Washington. And that seems to have taken this whole thing to another level, because nobody's apologized for the stuff that the disinformation people got right and might have saved lives and that they ignored.
Right. And the infrastructure of information regulation that was built up under the claim of the Great Russia threat was then immediately repurposed as a mechanism of domestic political control. During COVID, we just moved from one emergency to another, but it was essentially a seamless transition, one pseudo emergency to another, I should say, because the blurring of the lines between the Russian disinformation threat and the COVID disinformation threat happened immediately, were led by many of the same people. It was all this deliberately vague, ambiguous language. You started to hear about the infodemic, right? So there was a pandemic. Now there was an informational pandemic. So there was an infodemic, and it all reinforced the idea that people everywhere are under siege from dangerous information. That's the sort of, we can get into the particulars of what happened on COVID, but that's the point I would really want to stress, is that what all of this shares in common, what the disinformation framework, around Trump and Russia shares in common at its most essential elemental level with the disinformation framework around COVID and vaccines, is the idea that people are under grave threat from information itself, and that they need to be protected. We need to be protected from this dangerous, deadly information, and that the only way we can be protected is by entrusting these new information regulators who operate in secret because they can't afford to do this publicly, lest their methods be exposed to the enemy, and because these are matters of life and death, and there's a global pandemic, there's a threat from Russian disinformation. We don't have time to bother with normal democratic procedures. We don't have time to debate this stuff openly. People are dying right now. So there's always an exceptional emergency. There's always a state of exception that justifies suspending or contravening the Constitution and basic legal protections. And in the case of COVID, what we ended up getting was vastly more funding. And here's the critical kind of institutional point, vastly more funding now available to institutions across American society to do this narrative enforcement work around COVID. So you have this vast expansion of the counter-disinformation machine because the COVID federal budget for COVID opens up billions of dollars to various nonprofits. New government agencies get in on it. Everybody is in on the action now. And we're told that, people who are vaccine deniers or who are spreading false information about COVID, such as, the false claim that it might have originated in a laboratory in China, which was grounds for being censored on social media for a long time, that all of this brings together this emerging what had already been a powerful counter-disinformation machine. It makes it vastly more powerful, and it makes it more overt. So whereas the social media companies' cooperation and coordination with the government had been somewhat behind the scenes during 2016 to early 2020 during the Trump era, where, largely this was all happening behind the scenes. Now, COVID brings us out into the open. So now Google, Twitter, Facebook are not simply acknowledging that they're doing this censorship work. They're bragging about it. They're promoting the censorship that they're doing because they're boasting that this shows how serious they are about public safety. And so what are they actually censoring? Well, at various times, what gets classified as misinformation, because Google, for instance, just defaults to the WHO and to the National Institute of Health in America. So the question of what constitutes misinformation is always simply whatever the powerful institutions say, right? Because that's the Google position, is we're simply following what they don't want, the liability. So they default to whatever the WHO is saying. So that could have included at various points, if you looked at what the WHO and NIH were saying, for instance, the claim that masks were effective was disinformation, right? One day. The claim that masks were effective was misinformation or disinformation. Then a few months later, the claims that masks were ineffective was misinformation or disinformation. The claim that the vaccines did not prevent transmission. COVID vaccines did not prevent transmission. That was misinformation, disinformation, despite the fact that the pharmaceutical company executives, Pfizer executives themselves acknowledged this, that we now, it's now part of the public record. That could be disinformation. Calls to shut down travel could be misinformation. Claims that the virus may have originated from a lab leak. That was misinformation. So all of this was not only being done and more zealously policed, it was being done out in the open. And it took what was already this large and powerful machinery of informational control, and it made it now the sort of default of the most powerful institutions in American society.
Well, it was heroic, right? They thought heroic, right? I remember waking up one day and the World Health Organization had stealthily changed the definition of herd immunity. So it could only be conferred by vaccine, right? Natural, right? You couldn't get it. Natural immunity didn't count. I mean, they actually changed the definition they had on their website in order to facilitate belief of the vaccine. I nearly keeled over. I mean, believe that.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Stalinist, but, Stalin was at least kind of charismatic in his early years, at least.
But the other thing, too, about everything you just said, again, just to make this point for my audience, is a lack of granularity, right? None of the stuff they said, it was all declarative, but none of it was actually dealing with facts. They said the vaccines were safe and effective. What does that mean? Nobody answers the question. And now our prime minister, who is one of the most authoritarian vaccine celebrants in the world, is now saying, well, maybe they hurt some people. Well, wait a minute. You were mandating them 2.5 years ago and freezing the bank accounts of people who were questioning your doing that. And now it's, maybe, it's hard to live through this. I'm telling you, it is hard to live through it. I wish.
Yeah.
Because I know the old ways, I'm an old fart, and I know how media's always been trouble, but this is really difficult as someone who was a legacy media journalist back in the day doing good work for CBC Fifth Estate. I don't know. It's really difficult.
No, it's disheartening. And it's also, it's like fatiguing. It's exhausting to be sort of batted around this way between being lied to all the time, being inundated with lies by people who lie to your face, and then in the most sort of brazen and absurd ways, deny the thing they said yesterday because they've moved on to the next lie. It's tedious and exhausting.
Well, and nothing ever happens to the liars. That's the problem, right? We now have in Western governments around the world politicians who know they'll never be held to account as long as they're sticking to a script, and that's very dangerous. I want to just a couple more things, and then we'll wrap it up. But the laptop story, which is obviously a big part of this, now I think since you published has gone to a new level of bizarreness, right? That the Secretary of State for the current president, while he was running the campaign for the current president, orchestrated the letter of 50 people to say that it looked like a disinformation campaign.
Yeah, I mean, it has taken it to another level, and on the other hand, it's not surprising at all. So, I mean, I would have expected something like that, because the letter you're referring to is this, I believe was it 49 or 51 former top national security officials who produced this letter immediately after the Hunter Biden laptop reporting begins from the New York Post, saying this is likely Russian disinformation, and thereby effectively signaling to the press, you better not report on this, because if you report on this, we will blame you for spreading Russian disinformation and helping Donald Trump get elected, which of course is the worst claim you can make. It's like a horrifying threat to these people. And that's what gets Mark Zuckerberg to cave in 2016. They show him that they are going to blame him for getting Donald Trump elected. He has this coup inside his own company from his employees, and Zuckerberg knows that Facebook didn't get Trump elected. He knows that Russian infiltration of Facebook didn't swing the election. He has the internal auditing to prove this, but he has to go along with this narrative because they're blackmailing him effectively, or they're threatening him with the sort of destruction of his company through this false claim. And so the same thing works on the press when it comes to the Hunter Biden laptops, but now the press has already been conditioned over the previous 3 years to understand that it's supposed to play this role. And this letter has the intended effect, and the press doesn't report on this. And in fact, you get multiple journalists, excoriating the few dissenters who decide to try and report on this, or who suggest that, hey, maybe we should allow the New York Post, one of the oldest newspapers in the country's history, to report openly that that's what a free press is. And so now we learn, as you point out, that it wasn't just that these national security officials took it upon themselves to draft this letter, but that they received this instruction from the Secretary of State, which is not in the least surprising. Just to rewind the clock a bit and give listeners a sense of the timeline here, what's really critical to understand is that the FBI took possession of Hunter Biden's laptops in 2019. That means that when all of this debate and dispute about are the laptops Russian disinformation or aren't they was occurring, the FBI already knew definitively that they were not. They already knew definitively that they belonged to Hunter Biden, and that they were authentic. Now, of course, the Bidens also knew this, which is why Hunter Biden himself never denied that they were his laptops, right? Because he knew this, and that might have exposed him to legal liability. And in fact, Hunter Biden's lawyers, in a lawsuit that they filed recently, going after people for spreading his private information, have now openly acknowledged that the laptops were his. So the point is that everybody in power knew the truth. They knew that these were Hunter Biden's laptops. They knew that it wasn't Russian disinformation. So this was not simply an error of being overly cautious, of defaulting to, hey, if there's a possibility that they're Russian disinformation, we have to treat them that way, lest we find ourselves in a position where we're unintentionally doing the Kremlin's work by spreading this false dossier, right? That was a claim made by various experts and national security officials, that we can't be certain, we can't know for a certainty, but this has the hallmarks of Russian disinformation, and therefore we have to treat it that way and suppress reporting on it. And the suppression was unprecedented insofar as it went beyond merely censoring public reporting. So let's say public tweets. Everybody knows that if you tweeted out the New York Post's reporting, that got censored.
Yeah.
But Twitter was actually censoring DMs as well.
Wow.
So if you sent a private direct message to one of your friends, to your cousin, to your spouse, whomever, containing a link to the New York Post's reporting on Hunter Biden's laptops which, again, the entire national security establishment knew were authentic, that was censored as well. Your private DMs were censored. And so now we find out that this was not simply a self-organizing defense by these former national security officials, that it was a top-down directive from within the Biden chain of command. And I have to say, that's not surprising at all. All of this was not merely opportunistic. It was coordinated. And as one other piece of evidence demonstrating that coordination, Mark Zuckerberg, when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast, talked about the fact that in the summer of 2020, months ahead of the New York Post's first public reports on the laptops, the FBI agents visited him and told him to expect a some kind of Russian disinformation operation related to Hunter Biden coming in a few months. Right? So what does that mean? Again, the FBI had possession of these laptops since 2019. So they knew the laptops were authentic. So did these individual agents who visit Zuckerberg, did they know that? I don't know. So I can't say that those specific agents were intentionally lying, because I don't know what they knew or didn't know. But the agency knew, and despite knowing that they were authentic, they deliberately led Zuckerberg to believe that there was some kind of coordinated Russian disinformation campaign related to them coming down the pipe, which was the way to signal to Zuckerberg, hey, you better censor this stuff. And it worked, and they censored it. And so it all worked according to plan.
One of the things that's most horrific about this was Anthony Blinken we're talking about here, is watching then Joe Biden on the debate stage flat out lying. I mean, just blatantly lying. And I mean, call me old fashioned. I know politicians lie, but seeing it and understanding the kind of perfidy behind it, we live in an age where nobody says to themselves, ergo, right? So the Blinken thing drops and we understand what's happened, but we have to then pull back and say, well, how does that infect everything that we know so far? And what it means is that, Biden can stand on a debate stage and boldly lie after a member of his campaign has been dispatched to create a lie about his son. It means that he never discusses business with his son, which is obviously BS now anyway, but was a lie, and he knew he was lying when he said that. I mean, it's awful. It's so dirty and disgusting. And yet, I'm having that reaction as a human person and a journalist, and it feels like maybe a few people on Fox News are upset about it, but everybody else is just sort of rocking along. It's
bad. It's sordid.
Yeah, it's sorted. Okay, here's my last little bit I want to do with you, and I think it's important because it's what your piece says. The new one-party state. And you start that section by talking about this Time magazine article by journalist Molly Ball. I nearly fell off my chair when I read it, when it came out. I thought, what, are they admitting to rigging the election? Sort of looks that way. But tell me about that.
So her piece in particular, and I forget the exact title, but it was, a very sort of over-the-top title about this conspiracy to get Joe Biden elected. It was a sort of gloating title about the secret collusion that had occurred in order to prevent Donald Trump from getting elected and get Biden elected. And she was talking specifically in that piece about these deals that were made between labor unions and NGOs and civil society groups. And there are, it's possible to say that she was overstating the effect of some of this, but I think the real point is that she's gloating about it.
Yeah.
So in the context of all of this talk about the dangers of election denial and the dangers of these attacks on the integrity of the electoral system, here you have somebody in Time magazine sort of bragging about the subterfuge, bragging about the extraordinary coordinated campaign. And it's all justified in relation to Trump being a unique existential threat to the country. But, that becomes a license to do anything. And so, again, comes back to this idea that there's a loss of faith in democracy. Trump is supposed to be such a threat that it's okay to subvert the procedures of democracy. It's okay to work around the will of the voters. The important thing is to prevent this white supremacist fascist from taking power in America again. And that's Ball's piece. And it's only one particularly sort of exaggerated specimen in what's a whole genre of pieces bragging about the efforts undertaken by these nominally publicly interested civil society groups. And this is what the whole sort of election integrity infrastructure in the U.S. was about. Nominally nonpartisan, nominally only about upholding electoral integrity, but was in fact from the beginning about preventing Donald Trump's reelection.
Yeah. Well, it's really scary. And this obviously opens the door to the title of this particular section of the piece, which is the new one-party state. And with all of this kind of skullduggery and the actual, like real conspiracy and the information control, do the Republicans even ever really have a chance to govern again, do you think?
I don't know. Listen, we have to distinguish between the local political system and the national political system. So
nationally.
Certainly they can, Republicans can win local elections. Nationally, I'm sure that they do. I think that there are some extraordinary hurdles they need to overcome. And then the key question is, let's say you find somebody who can overcome all of this subversion, subterfuge, structural interference, and get into office. Can they govern in office? Right?
Yes.
Trump managed to win. He got into office, but he couldn't really govern. So it's an open question. I suspect that there are, brilliant strategic minds out there who could figure out a way, but it's beyond my capabilities.
Yeah. Well, you know what else? I will ask you this before we go, and that is Bobby Kennedy is kind of gaining popularity. I think it's really a long shot. But if he got in, I suspect they would treat him the same way they treated Trump, right? Because he's saying, the regulatory agency got to clean down. We don't want war. And I mean, would they do to him what they did to Trump, do you think?
I think they'd go after him even harder. I have to recommend to people, there's an incredible interview with Bobby Kennedy in Tablet Magazine where, I'm a senior editor, and we just published this really long, really incredible interview with Kennedy where he's like very open, talks about it, who he thinks was responsible for his father's assassination, talks about who he thinks was responsible for John F. Kennedy's assassination. It's an incredible interview. I think that because Kennedy looks like he poses some of the same dangers in terms of his positions that Trump did, but appears to be actually far more likable and more competent. You know, Trump's not competent. So one of the ironies here is that all of these efforts to subvert Trump, I don't know if it's an irony, but the efforts to subvert Trump could succeed to some extent because he hadn't grasped how Washington actually works. I think Bobby Kennedy has a much better sense of how Washington works. We don't know that he's managerially competent necessarily. Certainly he's not the deal maker that Trump was, but I suspect that he would be able to operate more effectively within the DC system, and that would make him an even bigger threat. So who knows what they would do if he managed to squeak past all the gatekeepers and win.
Well, I think he has to. I've been saying this. If I was his comms advisor, I would tell him he's got to do a big mea culpa on the skeletons in his cupboard, you know, to quote Hugh Grant in 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Like he said, he has many. And he admits it, which is good, but I think he's got to just do one thing, admit it, and then move on and not talk about it. But he's got to admit it because they're going to come for him with all kinds of stuff. He's like, he was an addict, right? So he did bad stuff. Bad stuff happens when you're drinking and using drugs too much. Likely a sex addict too, so we got to move on from there. But I think they would try to destroy, maybe they would try to kill him. I mean, who knows, right? I think nothing is off the table right now in American politics, sadly.
Yeah, I think that's sadly the case.
Yeah. Anyway, what a great piece this is. I'm so glad that that Tablet exists and that you're writing for it. It's great. Do a piece on Canada's Bill C-11 that just passed last night. No, this is a big problem for us.
Okay, I'm going to look into it.
Would you please? Yeah, let me know and
Absolutely.
I'll say something about it when you get it done. Okay, thank you very much. I'm very grateful to you. And how can people find you? I know you're at Tablet. Do you have a Twitter too, or how can people follow you?
Thanks, Trish. This is a great conversation. You can find me on Twitter at Jacob _ Siegel, Siegel. But just, Google my name, Jacob, and Siegel is Siegel. And I think the stuff will pop up.
Brilliant.
Oh, and let me just mention as well, sorry, I do a podcast called Manifesto, a podcast with my friend Phil Cly, which is more kind of literary stuff. But we talk about art and manifestos, so a bit of a break from the politics.
Oh, we all need it, right? Maybe we should do a podcast on grace and beauty or something too, which is gone.
Great idea.
I know. Anyway, nice to meet you, Jacob, and I'll talk to you another time, I hope.
You as well. Thanks, Trish.
Okay, bye-bye. So that was Jacob Siegel, who has written a great piece for Tablet Magazine called A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, 13 Ways of Looking at Disinformation. You must read it. It's long and it's dense, but you must read it. And now just pivoting, as they say, I'm just going to connect very briefly with Harold Jonker, who is one of the convoy truckers who last week was he went on his own, but he was asked to attend at the police station. He's been charged with the same kind of vague mischief type charges that have attended Chris and Tamara and others. Why they're doing it now is beyond me. And he's got to go to Ottawa to check in at the police station there next week, which he's going to do. It just seems, when are they going to give this up? Anyway, here is Harold Jonker. He's on the road somewhere near Detroit. Hi, Harold. How are you? Good. I can see you. You're in the cab of your truck, I guess. Where are you?
I'm in Battle Creek, Michigan. So you just got me out of bed.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I can start my day, I believe, in a half hour.
Okay, so were you asleep? Have you got a bed rigged up in the cab of your truck there, or is that where you were, or were you in a motel?
No, I was in my bed.
Yeah, nice. I always think those things are very cozy looking, those things.
Yeah. I didn't even have a chance to make my bed. No, just kidding. So, but
okay. So we've got a few minutes to do this, and I it's not a laughing matter really, because I was surprised to see a couple of days ago that that you've been charged for attending the trucker protest in Ottawa. Please tell me that story. What happened? How did you find out you were being charged, and what are you being charged with?
What I found out last Wednesday that the Niagara police had stopped at my house looking for me. My son gave them my cell number, and they tried to call me that Wednesday, and I missed that call. I was getting unloaded in Edmonton, so I didn't have the phone on me. And then Thursday, one of the Niagara Region police officers got a hold of me and informed me that I needed to turn myself in or to Niagara Police or let Ottawa Police know that I was going to be gone on a truck trip till today. I was fortunate enough to I had already planned to fly home for the weekend because of my daughter's confession of faith in church, so I turned myself in last Saturday. And I don't know where I have the list of what I've been charged with, but it's on my phone somewhere.
That's okay. But what's the gist of the charges? What is the most serious thing they've charged you with as far as you can tell and what your lawyer is saying to you?
Yeah, basically 2 counts of counseling an uncommitted indictable offense. And then so there's 2 counts of that, and then there's a count of intimidation by blockage of highway or something like that, and then mischief.
Yeah, mischief seems to be a big one. So you went down to the police station, did you?
Yes. So last Saturday when I got home, I flew home Friday night. So Saturday morning we went down to the police station with a few supporters and my wife and kids, and I was charged with those 4 things and signed a form saying that I would turn myself into Ottawa Police on May 10th, which is next week, Wednesday. So. And
which town did you go to the police in?
Oh, in Grimsby, Ontario. Niagara
in
Region.
Grimsby. Yeah. Okay, let me just, did any of the Niagara Regional Police in Grimsby who, I guess, booked you, if that's the phrase,
yeah,
did they explain why this was happening? I mean, do you know why this is happening now? I mean, it seems bizarre.
Yeah, no, I don't even think they know why. All the way I guess it works is right is one police association or the Ottawa Police had asked them to arrest me, and that's all they know.
Were they sheepish about it? Did they seem sheepish at all, or? Yeah,
they did. Yeah.
Yeah. What'd they say to you, Harold?
They were really good about it, actually.
Yeah.
I've always respected. I've always been brought up to respect the police, and I still do. Definitely, Niagara Region Police I respect a lot, and I'm thankful for what they do in our community. Yeah, that police officer that arrested me, it was a special moment in my life I'll never forget. That 2 brothers in the Lord were able to hug. So.
Oh, you mean the policeman hugged you? Did he hug you?
Yeah. So that was pretty special. So.
Why do you say that? Why do you say it was special, Harold?
Well, because I'm a Christian and he was as well, and 2 brothers in the Lord able to hug. That's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Wow. And so, has anybody explained to you? I'm assuming these charges stem from there's a Crown attorney in Ottawa somewhere who's asking for this. Do you know who the Crown is? Do you know why they're doing it now? Has any of this been explained to you? And do you have a lawyer?
I don't know why they're doing this for sure. I've talked to quite a few lawyers, and every single one of them just doesn't get it. Like, they're going, really? Now, Harold? Why now? Why 15 months later? That's definitely what everybody's scratching their head for. Maybe Wednesday I'll find out, but even then they'll probably won't say why now, right?
Yeah, you'll get some discovery later, I guess. But,
yes, yeah.
Yeah. And let me ask you this. You went to Ottawa. Tell me about that. How long were you there?
Yeah, this is where my lawyers are telling me to be very careful, right? But
okay. Well, it's evidentiary, but yeah.
Yeah, I was there the whole time. And it was a moment in history where we made history. We were a peaceful, law-abiding protests that, without really knowing what we were going to accomplish, we accomplished, I think, something beautiful. We gave people hope. We gave people a lot of joy when they came there. And yeah, we were peaceful and loving the whole 3 weeks we were there.
Yeah, I had coffee with Chris Barber the other day here in Toronto, and was surprised that he is still facing a whole bunch of stuff. He's got the criminal stuff and he's got a civil case. And part of me wonders if this kind of ongoing legal stuff that's happening to you people isn't what they call lawfare, where they want to tie you up. They want to make you spend your money on lawyers. They want to, I have no evidence. I don't know who the Crown is. This is just opinion on my part. But, did you do anything ostensibly illegal when you were in Ottawa that you recall that you should be going through this for, in your view? I mean,
no. And definitely we were not breaking the law. 2 judges on 2 separate cases, so I think it was a February 17th and February 14th. Two judges deemed it a lawful protest, and that's what we went by. And by the fact that we were there, and it was peaceful. There was no violence. There was nothing of that sort. And I have a couple other lawsuits as well that we're dealing with, and you kind of wonder if that's part of it. Why, right? So, yeah, basically kind of dealing with the same things Chris is dealing with, right, when it comes to the other lawsuits as well. So
you've got you're facing some civil cases as well, are you? Were you named?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And are those from civilians in Ottawa who are complaining about microaggressions or whatever the problem?
Yeah. I'm on the same lawsuit that Chris is on. Is one of them. Okay. And then the township of West Lincoln. I was a town councillor then, and somebody filed a complaint that I was there, and the integrity commissioner decided that it was an unlawful protest, and the township also punished me by taking a month's pay of mine from me, which was fine, but I have a lawsuit against the township for that as well.
Wow. And were you penalized at the time with any kind of bank account freezing or financial penalties that were brought to bear on some people?
Personally, I wasn't, but our business was shut down for a week after that.
Why was it shut down? Who shut it down?
The provincial government sanctioned. So our CVOR, commercial vehicle operation registration, was sanctioned for a week, which is run by the Ontario government, right?
Is there a connection between the protest and that, do you think?
Oh yeah, that was we were sanctioned for our participation there. Yeah.
Wow. And so what's next? Do you go to Ottawa on May 10th?
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes, on May 10th I got to turn myself in first thing in the morning there to the courthouse, and I think at 8:30, and then at 9 o'clock I'll be fingerprinted and processed. So I'll be meeting our lawyer. One of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms is willing to represent me, so they'll be sending me a lawyer there, and then I'll meet with the lawyer next week, maybe as well, that's going to represent me, and we'll see where this goes.
Are they going to put you in jail?
I hope not. I'm praying that I can spend a bit of time with some friends and supporters in Ottawa and that evening, and then also on May 11th is the March for Life in Ottawa, so I'm hoping to participate in that as well.
Right. And I guess my question to you, Mr. Jonker, is why you think this is happening to you. I mean, we saw the civil servants in Ottawa protesting, blocking roads, blocking bridges, being aggressive. And as far as I don't know if anybody was arrested there, I don't know. They were arrested, but the Emergencies Act certainly wasn't imposed. I'm just wondering, what do you think is going on here? And also, let me just say that while the civil servants were protesting, there were negotiations going on. And in the case of the truckers, there were, aside from the negotiations with the police, which went well, there were no negotiations around mandates or anything like that. So how do you explain what I will call the asymmetry in these two cases?
Yeah, I think, I guess the best way to explain things is to guess, right? Because that's all we can do. And,
yeah.
But I really think that what we're facing in our society is a global control that the elitists are working on, and our government's listening to somebody that they shouldn't be, and there's no negotiations with their agenda. And yeah, call it a conspiracy theorist or whatever, but you do wonder, like it just never made sense that they never sent anybody to talk to us. That's what we went there for, right? That's where you go to have a protest, and to never have anybody willing to sit down and talk to us was, yeah, shocking, I guess. And why? I don't know why. We are facing what we're facing, but I think our society is facing a higher force that there's no negotiating with.
Yeah. I don't know what to say. I mean, clearly there is a sort of a war on populism and on the citizenry that have not bought into leftist ideology. There's no question about that. And I don't think it's a conspiracy theory.
No.
I think they're blamed about it. But this is my last question, because I know you got to go. But are you frightened?
No. I'm a Christian, and I have faith in God. And wherever he's called me to go, I'll go. And where things go, we're not sure, but we do. I have that comfort that he's got me in his fatherly hands, and this is serving his purpose, even though we maybe don't always understand it and see it. And that's what gives me the comfort. My wife is in the same boat. We've been blessed with 13 children. They all understand what's going on, and we're sure of our journey. Just how it's going to go, we don't know, but where it ends, we know where it will end, and that's what gives me that peace of mind, even though it's pretty confusing.
It is confusing. I'm confused. Did I just hear you say you have 13 children, Mr. Jonker?
Yes, I've been blessed with 13 children, my wife and I. Yeah. So.
Wow, she's a busy lady.
Yeah.
Okay.
The oldest is 25. The youngest is 5. The older ones help, right? So it's not like you're doing everything by yourself at home. That's for sure. So.
Are you homeschooling?
No, they go to a private school. So yeah.
Yeah. Wow. I'm jealous. I always wanted to grow up in a big family, but it didn't work out for me. But I bet they're happy kids.
Yes.
Anyway, thanks, Mr. Jonker. Safe driving to you. And would you do me a favor, please, and just stay in touch with us? We want to know how this plays out, and let me know who your lawyer is and how things go in Ottawa, would you?
Yeah, will do. But yeah, definitely the JCCF, I'm very thankful for the support they are giving a lot of people. And we do need to, they're going to need support, right? As well, financially to keep the fight going for in all the cases that they're representing across this country.
Yeah, I've mentioned that on the show, and I will continue. I'll continue to do so, because this is, I don't know how you fight this. Everything requires a lawyer. Lawyers are expensive. I think they count on that. And, so it's a very, very strange time, but I'm so grateful to you, and thanks ever so much for doing this.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Have a safe driving. Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye. So that was Harold Jonker of Jonker Trucking in Ontario. He was not in Ontario, but that's where the trucking company is. And they are continuing to charge people. It's what I call lawfare. This is the new way. They tie you up knowing you can't afford lawyers. And if it's not a civil suit, then it's a criminal case. It's really not good. I don't like to see where this is going at all. So I said I was going to just read a little bit from this letter I got from a woman who listens to the show, and she talks about her feelings of not being able to access her 12-step group during COVID-19. These are not small issues for people. They're big issues for people, and it's very, very scary. I went through some really terrifying stuff myself, as did my kid, as you know. So I just wanted to read this, and then we'll say goodbye. Hi, Trish. I listen to your podcast regularly, and you truly helped me to not completely lose my mind during the last couple of years. I hear that a lot. And you guys have saved my sanity as well, by the way. I appreciate the work you do so much. As a fellow 12-stepper, I feel the need to reach out for insight or advice. Prior to the pandemic, I was a member of OA, which is Overeaters Anonymous, and yes, food addiction is a thing, and was able to find recovery around the eating disorder and food addiction that had ruled my life since I was a child. I got to a healthy weight. I nurtured a relationship with my higher power. I found a community who understood me. I felt the most balanced and well that I have ever felt in my adult life. When the pandemic hit, I struggled with online meetings. I hated them. I suffered through them. I relapsed and then fought my way back on track. Once warmer weather arrived, I helped organize and religiously attended outdoor meetings for a tiny group of us who didn't find the online meetings helpful. I bit my tongue when people used their meeting time to vent about their stupid anti-vaxxer relatives, friends, co-workers. In the second summer of outdoor meetings, 2021, I cried one day when someone offered actual real hugs and said that they didn't care whether people were vaccinated or not. I let my guard down when they saw me crying and told them I was not vaccinated, that their offer of a hug regardless of vaccine status was deeply appreciated. Later that day, I got an email from that very person telling me that I was ill-informed, silly, and putting everyone, including myself, at risk. That they were scared for me and begged me to listen to my higher power and do the right thing. I never went back to that outdoor meeting. By fall of 2021, I was barely hanging on to my abstinence. I continued to despise online meetings, but kept trying to make it work. And then one member announced that she was organizing 2 indoor meetings per week, despite the objections of the main organizers in my city. But that proof of vaccination was required to attend. This member knew me well. She knew that I was desperate for in-person meetings, and she knew that I was not vaccinated. That was it. I called my sponsor that night and told her I was done. I couldn't stand another online meeting, and if I wasn't permitted to attend in-person meetings, then I was done. I was giving up. I immediately fell into the worst period of disordered eating I had ever experienced. I honestly think I was trying to kill myself with food. I was certainly drowning my despair regarding the state of the world in food. I gained 100 pounds in 6 months or more. I stopped weighing and sunk into a deep depression. This last year and a half has changed me in ways that I don't know can ever be undone. And here's my question. How can I ever return to a program that so callously excluded me? I know that the steps saved me, and yet I am so hurt and will never again trust that I will always be welcome at these meetings. I was never worried about COVID killing me, but I worry that my addiction might, and yet I can't get over that feeling that I can never trust putting my eggs in that basket again. Can you relate? Have you moved past this? I feel so stuck and value any insight from a like-minded 12-stepper. So I hear that from a lot of people who were offended, hurt, damaged, relapsed because of the way some of the 12-step meetings handled COVID-19. And I don't give advice really on the show. I can only say what I have done with this. And listen, I had a major resentment going because there was a relapse involved, not with me, but with my kid. And it was very scary and life-threatening. Yeah, I was mad too. But I think what we have to do, the way we have to think about this, is that the 12 steps and other programs that were shut down during COVID, we have seen the miracle. We know they saved lives. My life was saved. I quit drinking 22, 23 years ago. And we call it the miracle. I've seen the miracle happen. So I think what we have to do is just appreciate that the 12-step rooms are full of human beings. And people have foibles. And people get scared and do selfish and awful things. But that doesn't mean that the program itself has been in any way tainted. I don't think we should look at it that way. I think we have to return and do the best we can with what we've got. And really the issue is not with the program even itself, right? It's with our higher power. That's how we're supposed to hand over ourselves so that we can get sober or abstinent or whatever your problem seems to be. So I would just say, be gentle with the people who are mean to you. You have a right to be angry, but it's not going to get you anywhere. And I'm saying this to everybody who is struggling post-COVID with what we saw human beings were capable of. Yuck. I mean, it was awful. But we have to find a way to make peace in the world. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, everybody's caught in their own informational silo. Families are being torn apart by different worldviews created by different sources of information. And I think we have to default to the idea that we're all human, and we've got to find a way to come back together. And for addicts, that's in the 12-step rooms. That's just, there's nothing else that works as well as it does. My advice is to go back and do whatever you need to do that with an open heart, because you're looking after yourself. It's not about them, it's about you. And so that's it for this week. I've got a Substack out about the CRTC holding a hearing about dropping Fox News from the cable channel because a gay and trans organization has demanded it. And I go into detail about how that came about in the Substack. It's a pretty interesting story. So I hope I'll see you there. And I hope I'll see you next week. In the meantime, stay critical. See ya.